So I'm going to be doing two very different presentations today. This first one is very scientific. Therefore, it's requisitely presented in a very sober style with an amount of seriousness that's required of such presentations. The one at lunchtime is a lot more dynamic, like talking to normal humans rather than scientists, partly because I'm speaking to young people who will be twittering if I don't entertain them, and also because that's how you speak to the public around this area. So this morning's talk is going to be on GMOs, which is actually quite a serious topic, or a sad topic, depending upon how long you've been in this debate. And you may have heard my introduction. I'm actually kind of work in beef cattle genetics, and so that's really where I hang out. That's why my Twitter handle is BioBeef. And I'm not even a plant geneticist, but I do a lot of talking and work around the GMO issue, which is, I think, why I'm going to be speaking here today about this particular topic, which, of course, is a very controversial topic, and one that's in the news a lot. And for those of us that have been working in SciComm around this area, a rather annoying topic, because the same misinformation keeps rearing its head every year or so, and it just seems like we can never get the discourse going in the right direction. It's a little bit like the vaccine debate. And so it's really an area, I think, that's really important, as I hope I will outline today, given the importance of GMO feed in animal agriculture globally. And what I would like to do today, for those of you who don't have a feeling for actually how widespread the use of this technology is, go through where it's being used in animal agriculture, and then I will discuss a study that I did looking at the health of animals that have consumed genetically engineered crops, and then a little bit about the pipeline of what's coming down the pipe, and then finish at the end with a little bit of the discussion around the toxicity of this politicized scientific debate on this particular topic. So this slide is requisite. If you're going to talk about GMOs, you have to put this slide up. And basically, it just gives you an overview of the countries that are growing genetically engineered crops, which are the green ones, and then the overall uptake since it was first introduced there in 1996. So we're actually at the 20-year anniversary of having this technology used as a breeding method in our crop production. And what you can see here is there's been a gradual uptick of the adoption of this technology. And I think what's interesting now is 18 million farmers globally are growing genetically engineered seed. Well, farmers I know generally don't take up a technology unless they're getting a benefit from it. And so that tells me that 18 million farmers are deriving a benefit from it. And what's really quite compelling to me is the fact that the acreage being grown in the developing world is actually greater than the acreage that's grown in the developed world. And in fact, over 16 million farmers that are growing these crops are small-sized acreage plots in the developing countries. So although it's often put out there as the purview of large multinational agribusinesses, it's actually benefiting a lot of farmers, particularly insect-protected crops in China and India is really where a lot of those farmers are located. And despite what you'll read on the internet, and as my common sense tells me if 18 million farmers have adopted this technology, there's a benefit to adopting the technology. And if you look at the literature, on average, this is a kind of a meta-analysis that was done in 2014, the technology has reduced chemical pesticide use, despite what you'll read, and a lot of that is due to insect-protected crops, where if you've protected them with BT, you no longer need to spray insecticides on there. It has increased crop yields through protecting those crops from insects and weeds, mostly, not necessarily increasing the intrinsic ability of those crops to grow, but rather protecting them from pests that otherwise would take away productivity, and has increased farmer profits by 68%, particularly in the developing world. And the yield and profit gains tend to be higher in developing countries, in part because there the pests are otherwise uncontrolled. So in the US, if you didn't have GM crops, you would be able to protect your crops in other ways, whereas in the developing countries it may be the insects just get the better of that crop and then there's no food coming out of that crop. And I particularly like this corn field, which is actually taken in Northern California on a acreage that doesn't allow the use of anything for weed control. And it's a little hard to see the corn in there. But not surprisingly, a situation like this is not a very productive cornfield. And basically, overall, the technology has added about 110 million tons of soybeans and 195 million tons of corn to global production due to the fact that it's protecting it from the pests that otherwise would decrease the productivity of these plants. So what crops in the US are actually genetically engineered, and GE is going to be my shorthand for genetically engineered? Actually, not that many. There's only a handful, really. But they're the big ones. So corn, cotton, soybeans, sugar beet, alfalfa, canola, papaya, and then a small amount of squash, melons, and sweet corn. And so if you're looking for non-genetically engineered feedstuffs, it's everything else. And particularly, I point out wheat here because a lot of the sites you'll find will be blaming the fact that people have gluten intolerances and the celiac disease. They'll blame that on GMO or genetically engineered crops. And there actually isn't any genetically engineered wheat on the market, so you'll have to blame someone else for that. That's not going to be this particular breeding method's fault. And in fact, I believe that this is now 100% of all sugar beets planted in the United States, due to the fact that really the herbicides available to sugar beets in the absence of having Roundup-ready sugar beets is not a very attractive proposition for the sugar beet farmers, and so it's been very widely adopted in that industry. And if we go and have a look at why the United States farmers have been planting these, looking at a report from the US National Academy of Sciences in 2010, it concludes that they're realizing substantial economic environmental benefits such as lower production costs, fewer pest problems, reduced use of pesticides and better yields compared with conventional crops. And that's coming from the National Academy of Sciences. And those of you that follow this area will know that just this year, a very comprehensive report was released by the National Academy of Sciences. And just to clarify, that is the premier scientific society of our entire country. And it was actually a very comprehensive report. I think it's maybe 400 odd pages, where this group that's listed here, and I work in the area of breeding and genetic engineering. I personally don't know one single person on this list. I think the National Academy tried to get people who were absolutely pristine with regards to any conflict of interest or having ever worked with any of the breeding industries, to try to get just, you know, what scientists do. They'll come together and look at data and come to a conclusion as to what the data shows, and to try to get rid of the whole corporate shill accusation that everybody's in and bought off by Monsanto. And so this particular group came together and they looked at all of the relevant literature, and there's over 1,000 different studies that have looked at the safety and the environmental impacts of GMs. They had information gathering meetings and they read more than 700 comments that were submitted by members of the public. And basically this slide is somewhat analogous to the one I showed earlier, which again just shows which countries are growing GM crops and which crops are being grown where. And I think rather staggeringly, it's now about 12% of the world's cropland is planted to genetically engineered crops. That's a pretty sizable chunk of the world's cropland. And you can see there's large areas that don't allow the planting of genetically engineered crops, in part due to this kind of public discourse and angst around this technology. And what the committee did was, with this group of independent scientists, re-examine the original studies. So they looked through all of those studies and had a look at the ones that had been done with animals, be it rat studies or large animal studies. They looked at long-term data on health and feed conversion efficiency in livestock of interest to this group. They looked at comparative data on the crops. And then, interestingly, they did something where they looked at the human epidemiological data with regard to health of populations of humans that have been consuming GM crops for 20 years, so read North America, and populations that haven't, read Europe. And basically, although that's going to have a bit of noise in there, had a look if there was any difference in the prevalence of human conditions such as cancer or autism or all the rest of the things that you see blamed on GMOs, to kind of have a feel whether there's any evidence that that's actually a problem. And what their conclusion was is that there's no pervasive evidence of adverse health effects directly attributable to consumption of food derived from GE crops. And that's the opinion of every major scientific society in the entire world, and has been for almost 20 years now. And so that wasn't an unexpected finding, but I think this was done in a way to try to put aside this suggestion that all of the scientists that are talking basically about the scientific consensus on this topic are not just doing it because they're getting paid off by companies. And it becomes a little preposterous to think that every scientist in the world that agrees with this consensus is actually being paid off. At some stage, I don't know that many scientists that ever agree on anything, let alone having the global consensus. And so, of course, the caveat is always that you could produce a dangerous product. I could put a protein, I don't know, the botulism toxin gene into a plant and make a very dangerous genetically engineered crop. I don't know why I would. You could, but nothing has been shown to date to be dangerous because the proteins that are expressed, the BT, the Roundup Ready, are not human safety concerns. And so I think that this data, to me, really should put to bed this suggestion that there's human health effects. Of course, the activists, the minute this thing got released, they suggested that these people had conflict of interests, and despite the fact that the study was paid for by independent sources, they tried to basically malign the data by suggesting inappropriate conflicts of interest to try to discredit the information that came out of, after all, the National Academy, which is, again, the premier scientific society in the nation. So with that background, I just want to talk about the global growth of genetically engineered crops. And basically what this little graphic shows is the little hashtags is the proportion of different countries that's genetically engineered crops. And so you can see, for example, in corn in the United States, this is the genetically engineered segment of the pie, and this is the non-genetically engineered segment of the pie. And you can see globally about 35% of all corn grown is genetically engineered, and there's quite large blocks here, particularly in China, where they don't allow the growing of genetically engineered corn, that is a solid hash. Soy, it's a little bit of a different series here, so approximately 79% of global soy is now genetically engineered varieties, and particularly the big three in that space is the USA, Brazil, and Argentina in terms of growing genetically engineered soy. And so this growth pattern, therefore, has a big impact on the export availability of genetically engineered crops globally. So this is looking at corn, and I'll just go slowly through this graph because there's three in a row that look at this. And so the blue bars is the production, and you can see the US, I had to actually do a break in the bar because they're by far the biggest producer of corn. And they're second to China there. And then in terms of imports, so the big three growers of exporters of corn then are Argentina, Brazil, and the United States. So the big exports that are in the global trade are coming from those three countries. And then the big importers are China and the European Union. And you can see China grows a lot of corn and then imports a little piece, and the EU imports a little as well. Soy is really the interesting one to me. So here we have the production, again, shown in blue. And so the three biggies there are Argentina, Brazil, and the United States. And then, not surprisingly, therefore, the big exporters of soybean, are Argentina, Brazil, and the United States. And then the really big importers is China, and the European Union. And we're talking here raw beans, and you can see China is a humongous importer of beans. So this is beans, and now I'm going to move to soybean meal, okay? And what you see here is now China's a very big producer of soybean meal. That's not because they're growing the beans in China. That's because they're making meal of the beans they imported on the previous graph. And so, again, the big exporters of meal are Argentina, Brazil, and the United States. And the big importers in this case is actually not China, because they're just doing their own meal, but rather the European, that's shown there. And then the European Union is a very big importer of soybean meal. So given what I've just told you, it probably doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the big producers and exporters of these crops are mostly growing genetically engineered varieties of the crops. And so if you look at the share of global trade in these commodities, particularly soybean and corn, and actually I didn't go through cotton and canola, but you can see that the majority of global trade is genetically engineered varieties of these four big commodity crops. And that's basically because that's the countries that are growing them is doing the exporting of them. And so As I showed, the EU is importing a lot of soybean meal, and it imports a lot of its feed to support animal agriculture. It's estimated about 80% of all livestock feed in the EU is imported, and not surprisingly, therefore, there's a lot of import of genetically engineered feed. And so we'll often hear that Europe doesn't grow genetically engineered crops, and that's actually quite true, although there's a little bit grown in Spain. But they're very, very reliant on genetically engineered feed for their livestock. And if they were not able to import soybean protein from outside the EU, it could only estimated to replace about 10 to 20% of its imports by high protein substitutes. And there would have to be a dramatic reduction in the overall animal industries in Europe if they were to overnight say, we're not going to accept any more genetically engineered feed. Of course, the market could adjust by planting non-GE feed, but that's basically what the current situation is. And so, in fact, there's the growers there are ending their avoidance of having genetically engineered products in their feed because they're having a hard time sourcing non-genetically engineered products. And interestingly, in the EU, it's not required to label the milk, meat, or eggs from animals that have consumed genetically engineered feed, despite the fact that you do have to label human food if it is derived from genetically engineered crops. Globally, really, the biggest consumers of this technology are our global livestock populations. If we talk about consumers of GM, we're really talking about our animals. It's estimated that somewhere between 70 and 90% of harvested GE biomass is fed to food-producing animals. And there's been a number of review papers that have looked at the animal feeding studies that have been done where the performance and the health of animals consuming these crops has been evaluated in controlled settings where you've got groups that are eating genetically engineered varieties of feed, and then they have a control group that's eating an isogenic line from the parent that hasn't been genetically engineered with whatever the trait is. And you can, if you look at the literature, there's hundreds of studies. This particular gentleman, Flauchowski, has done a boatload of these types of studies, and this is just one particular summary table looking at a bunch of different ruminants, and then of interest to this group, swine and poultry. And basically, they've seen no unintended effects in terms of consumption. The animals are eating the feed, and in fact, the only kind of unintended thing they often see is lower levels of mycotoxin in the insect-protected crops, because if the insects are not boring into those crops, then you have less opportunity for fungal infection and mycotoxin development. And no significant differences in digestibility or health as shown by the performance of those animals. And some of these studies also do dissections of the animals and have a look for various unintended health effects. And if you're interested, the FAS, the Federation of Animal Science Societies, maintains a list of animal feeding studies, and you can go in there and look at it broken down by crop or species if you just want to look at pig studies, or maybe pig studies with corn that's BT or anything like that, and you can have a look at what the scientific literature says. And so with that background, I'll just talk a little bit about this particular study, which apparently caused a bit of angst amongst some of the groups that are opposed to this technology. I reasoned, and my lab manager, that we've now got a lot of data on animals that have been consuming genetically engineered crops, namely the United States livestock populations, who are living in a country where 95% of corn, 95% of soybean, 95% of canola is all genetically engineered, and consequently they've been consuming predominantly genetically engineered feed for almost 20 years now. And so what we did was have a look at the USDA data in terms of the performance, productivity and health of our livestock populations before the introduction of genetically engineered crops and after the introduction of genetically engineered crops. And so this is obviously a field data set. It doesn't have the control of a non-GE side to side with a GE, but it does have the kind of its epidemiology, I guess, almost, what was going on before it was introduced and what was going on afterwards. And the reason this data set caught the attention of, I guess, the media, and it got a little bit of publicity, is just the sheer number of animals that are involved in animal agriculture, and particularly chickens, just because we consume somewhere around about 9 billion at B broilers in the United States every year. And so if you start to look at 10 years of broiler data, you're looking at, 90 billion chickens. And then you add in there the cows and the hogs, and you total over a period from 2000 to 2011, it's somewhere in the vicinity of 105 billion animals. Mostly chickens, but that's what the data is. That's what we eat, right? So I can't help that they're mostly chickens. I got a lot of criticism because there was too many chickens in my data set. Well, that's just what we eat. So I'm sorry. You guys would be happy if it was billions of pigs probably, but that's just what it is, And so, so basically, the data we showed were unremarkable. So basically the little arrow there shows when GM feed started coming into the feed supply. And where I've kind of drawn the lines there is just having a look at the slope because we figure it took a few years to get up to a reasonable amount of genetically engineered feed. Having a look if there was differences in the slope. And this is, of course, the rate of improvement, be it milk or beef or pigs or broilers. And as a geneticist, I look at that and I say, that's genetics happening there. I'm sure the nutritionists look and think, well, that improvement's due to what we're doing, and the health people probably think it's due to them. Irrespective, there tends to be a trend going up every year, whether it's genetics or the combination of those three. But the slope was not different between before and after. And so if you had a bunch of animals that were sick and unthrifty and unwell and not eating and getting cancers and, big lumpy tumors, I wouldn't expect to see that there'd be no change in the overall slope. And then there's not that much data on the health that's collected by the USDA over time, but there is a little bit. So some of the things we could look at in dairy cattle, for example, is somatic cell score, which of course is an indication of mastitis or inflammation of the mammary gland, which if you had an unwell animal, you would expect to be going up. This is percent post-mortem condemnation as done by the vets examining animals going through the slaughterhouse. You may have seen some literature suggesting that there's these huge tumours that you get from eating genetically engineered feed, as the Seralini rat study. You would have expected higher levels of post-mortem condemnation rates if there were these huge unexpected tumours in these dairy cows, which would have been consuming feed for years on end. And similarly, the milk production. And what we see here is, a downward trend. Now, I'm not suggesting that's cause and effect with GE feed. This is due likely to other management factors, but it's certainly not going in the direction that indicates poorer health. If anything, it's going in a direction that suggests that they're getting condemned less often. And the broiler statistics, again, are very compelling to me, just because if you think about it, each dot on these graphs represents about 9 billion averaged population. And so even a small impact on mortality in broilers or their feed conversion ratio, which if you're not well, you're not going to be converting well, would be evident in these data. And again, we're not seeing disturbing trends or anything that suggests that the increase of there's an increase in condemnation rates or an increase in mortality or age to market or feed to gain, all things that you would be perturbed if the animals were unwell. And then a special treat for you guys, it's not in the paper, only to be seen in this particular little room, is some swine data, which was not that trivial to get. And basically it required doing a Freedom of Information Act request to get this data of USDA FSIS records. And so here's ante-mortem condemnation and post-mortem condemnation. We don't have the previous area, but here 2000, there's already relatively high levels. And again, if anything, it's a downward trend, but certainly not going up, which you would expect if the animals appeared more sick or less thrifty or had big tumors. And pigs, of course, are the most analogous to humans in terms of their metabolism and single monogastric stomach and all the rest of it. And so this data, I think, again, supports what all the other data is saying, which that there haven't been deleterious effects from this particular breeding method on the animals that are consuming those crops. So one question that I often get is, can you tell if a pig or a cow or a chicken has eaten genetically engineered crops? Do we need to label the milk, meat and eggs? And basically, as with humans, and I don't know what you had for breakfast, I just had I don't know what that was, the little chocolate Rice Krispie treat. I'm not too worried that the DNA that I ate in that Rice Krispie treat is going to do anything deleterious to me, or that the proteins in that are going to do anything other than get digested. And similarly, when animals eat genetically engineered crops, they do the same thing. And so it is not possible to detect in the milk, meat, or eggs of animals whether or not they've digested genetically engineered crops, because they digest it themselves and then it gets turned into the pig or the chicken. And so there actually is no way to test if milk, meat, or eggs have come from animals that have consumed genetically engineered crops. And the labeling of such products is not required anywhere in the world from a mandatory perspective, even in Europe. If you're interested, CAST, the Council for Ag Science and Technology, has a freely available paper on the safety of milk, meat, and eggs from animals fed crops derived from modern biotech, also known as genetically engineered crops, that talks about this. So I want to just talk a little bit now about the projected trends in what's happening with genetically engineered crops, in part due to this anticipated increase in global demand for animal protein products. And so this little graph shows the developed world as the solid bars, with meat being in red and milk being in purple. And the dashed bars are projected increases in the developing countries, driven mostly by population growth and increased income disposability, not necessarily by the fact that they're converting to a Western-style diet with very large amounts of animal protein. It tends to be a small amount per capita increase in animal protein, but because there's a lot of people involved, it's creating that trend. So how is this going to be addressed from the global perspective of increasing food, animal source food? Well, part of animal source food, 70% of costs of production, something like that, is going to be feed. And so, not surprisingly, there's a lot of groups working to try to genetically engineer crops to be better suited for animal feed. So the first generation of crops tended to be herbicide tolerant and insect protected, disease resistant also in the case of the papaya, which tended to be traits that were beneficial for the growers, but it didn't necessarily impact the animals that were consuming that feed. They were substantially equivalent. This next second generation tends to be crops where we're actually trying to alter the crop so that it's better for consumption by the animals. And the main 4 traits that are under research is decreased phytate, increased amino acids, improved digestibility, and enhanced oil content in the crop, because oils are have more metabolizable energy than starch. And obviously that's going to improve the food conversion ratio. And interestingly, it's not only the US that's working in this, it's the EU, which is kind of ironic to me because it's basically impossible to get a genetically engineered crop approved in Europe. And so I'm not sure what these 14 events are going to end up with. But China and Japan are also working in this field. And so we have a larger group globally working to try to improve our feed for animals, genetically engineered feed. And that just gives you a feel for the number of events that are in the pipeline. And when I say in the pipeline, I've only highlighted here those that are actually in field trials. So it's not like, oh, it'd be great if we could do this. We've actually done this, and it's in the field now getting tested to see whether or not the trait that was being targeted is actually happening in those crops. And what's interesting and a little bit nerve-wracking to me is all of the different countries that have these crops in the pipeline, because we have a serious problem with asynchronous regulatory approvals where a product will get approved in the United States but then not be approved in Europe or not be approved in China or not be approved in some other country, and it causes trade disruptions. And when you start having this many different groups working on these things, you can kind of imagine kind of a bit of a trade wreck when these products all come to market. And you can see that they're all working on the traits that really are designed for improved animal feed stuffs. So some of the potential benefits from these crops could be enhanced uptake of phosphorus. Of course, that was what there was a genetically engineered pig that was expressing phytase, the Enviro pig. That's been shelved and put into a semen tank somewhere. So now we're trying to attack it from the crop perspective, which of course is going to reduce phosphorus pollution. Enrichment for essential amino acids, which is important both from an animal perspective and also from a humanitarian perspective for actual human food for countries that have micronutrient deficiencies. Increasing forage digestibility, which of course is going to result in increased weight gain, and increased cell wall digestibility, which just in and of itself is going to have beneficial effects in terms of consumption and the amount of feed that's required to feed an animal to get the same amount of gain. And then there's some groups working on alternative sources of omega-3 fatty acids, particularly for fish feed, but there would be no reason you couldn't give that to monogastrics as well. And so relative to the commercialization of these events, by definition, these crops are going to be different. They're not going to be substantially equivalent because they've been designed not to be. They're going to have higher levels of omega-3 or lower levels or higher levels of phytates or lower levels of phytate. So how is that going to be handled from a regulatory perspective when they are different? And there's actually metabolic effects of having a difference there in the animals. And interestingly, from a structural perspective, if the benefits of growing these crops derives to the livestock producer feeding the crops, how's the grower of the crops, who's not necessarily the same person, going to be recompensed for growing a speciality crop for animal feed, if in fact they're not actually feeding that feed to the animal? So that's going to require some sort of supply chain segregation to keep those better improved feedstuffs separate so that the farmer who's growing them can be rewarded. And then this problem of asynchronous approvals is a real issue, and that basically refers to approval in the exporting country before it's been approved for import into the importing country. And as I mentioned, that has and will likely lead to widespread trade disruptions due to the fact that this one breeding method has this particularly onerous regulatory burden associated with getting an approval, whereas all the other breeding methods, mutagenesis, don't have that particular regulatory burden. And so I think Nick Kay from the University of Missouri, I don't say his last name for obvious reasons, but he really succinctly summarized some emerging trends in terms of increased regulatory asynchronicity in the future, and that is that there's this expanding pipeline of genetically engineered novel crop events that are basically second-generation crops with modified output traits. Rather than helping farmer grow, they're going to help the output in some way to be better suited to its purpose. There's an expanding range of species that's being targeted globally, and there's an expanding global hectarage of these GE crops, and a growing number of countries that are actually trying to develop genetically engineered crops. And basically, there's many countries that have a very nascent and inexperienced regulatory team who have looked to the kind of Europe as how to do things. And of course, Europe is effectively blocked in the precautionary principle from approving anything at the moment. And that's really a problem when, for example, Africa, which probably has much more dire need for some of these products, looks to them as a model for how to allow innovation in the breeding programs. And so that's really potentially going to be a bit of a trade issue for livestock feed, which of course has relevance to this particular audience. So I just want to touch on the fact that, of course, there's some groups who are pushing hard to stop feeding genetically engineered crops to our animals, and given how prevalent it is in the United States to grow genetically engineered animal feed crops, it's not that trivial to source feed that's not genetically engineered. And so we have groups pushing on branded products to not use these products. And so I just want to touch on the availability and costs of non-genetically engineered feed. And so I've already gone through the crops that are planted, most, big crops that are mostly genetically engineered. And so one way that you can go about sourcing non-GE feed is by purchasing organic feed, because organic prohibits the use of genetically engineered seed in its production systems. But of course that comes with an added cost, because the cost of actually purchasing and growing that feed is higher, and depending on the year, it's somewhere in the vicinity of 50% higher than the conventional feeds. And it varies, of course, supply, demand, all of that good stuff. And assuming that there is a demand for that, there's no reason that farmers couldn't go back to growing non-GMO crops. But for them to forego the benefits that I outlined at the beginning of this talk in terms of control of pests and increased productivity, there's going to have to be obviously a price premium associated with basically the market telling the farmer, I will give you an extra price premium if you grow non-genetically engineered feed. And this is just some data that we had in our paper that was looking at the price differential for corn and soy in the period of 2011 to 2013, and that's the price difference for organic versus conventional, which is typically genetically engineered. And I'm not an economist, but it doesn't take me much to figure out that's going to be more expensive to feed non-genetically engineered feed to animals, and therefore the products will be more expensive. So that's that. And I will just, this was the final picture that was in our paper that was looking at the genetically engineered feed and the animal health, just showing the proportion of US agriculture currently that is under organic production. And so you can see the beef, milk, broilers and layer hens. Sorry, I didn't have pigs in here. Where the little red segment is the proportion that's currently being grown organically. And so it's not certainly not the majority of animal agriculture. It tends to be a fairly small percentage. It's less than 1% in the case of meat from beef, for example. And then what you also see is if you look at the global or the US hectareage or acreage of corn, soybeans, hay, pasture and rangeland and cropland, it's a very small amount that's grown under organic production systems. And so if there is a big demand increase for this type of forage and feedstuffs, one potential source, and what's happening already, is to import that from other countries. And so we have this kind of bizarre situation now where we're growing genetically engineered soybeans to ship over to China, and then we're importing organically raised soybeans to bring back here for our organic production systems in the United States. And what part of that is sustainable beats me. It's a very, very strange situation. So I've spoken a little bit about that study that I did, and I just want to finish in the last couple of minutes with something that's going on at our public sector universities that you may not be aware of, but it impacts me, so I'm going to let you guys know about it. And that is that groups that don't like the outcome of peer-reviewed research that's coming out of our universities have taken to defaming the reputation of the scientists who are putting out this information. And so this is referencing the study I mentioned in the Journal of Animal Science, where I looked at USDA data on the health and productivity of animals before and after the introduction of genetically engineered crops. It's publicly available data, guys. I didn't get it from Monsanto. I got it from the USDA website. And basically, these groups are really starting to try to trash peer-reviewed independent science coming out of our land-grant universities. And so I'm not sure if this is a badge of honor to have my study on a roll of toilet paper, or it's a bit of a slam, but it is something that came out very soon afterwards, and then several web pages went up that tried to demean my credibility and to suggest that this review paper, and I welcome you to read the paper. You tell me if I say anything in there that's that you find to be scientifically inaccurate or incredible. But then what's happening now is that myself and several of my colleagues who do public outreach, which I'll talk about at lunchtime, in this particularly toxic area have been subject to these Freedom of Information Act requests. And this is being done by groups that are funded by, in my case, the Organic Consumers Association is funding a group called US Right to Know to go after my emails to try to find out if there's some inappropriate collusion between myself and industry, and particularly the plant biotech industry, which is kind of ironic to me because I'm actually an animal breeder. And so I work with animal breeding companies. I don't work with Monsanto necessarily. And it's kind of interesting. I saw that on your sponsor sheet here, you've got Bayer as one of your sponsors, who of course just, I don't know, merged or bought or whatever. They're now a part of Monsanto. And so I'm pretty sure I'm going to start having all my emails about this conference now FOIA'd, because I ate that damn Rice Krispie treat, and Bayer probably helped fund that. So now I'm a shill. It's true. But I want to give you a feel for the scope of these things, because you might think, oh yeah, FOIA requests, whatever. So this is a FOIA request I got in October, and it basically, pursuant to the Freedom of Information Act Request Act, in my case in California, they want all documents related to or concerning the study I outlined, between myself and my co-author, and then they included a copy of the study. And then all documents related to or concerning any communications among UC Davis, that's the entire campus, and Monsanto, because they're evil. And then all documents related or concerning any communications between Monsanto related to genetically engineered and or genetically modified feedstuffs, crops, agriculture, pesticides, or herbicides. and all documents related to UC Davis and Monsanto Company. And so it's like, that's a very broad request because, well, UC Davis is a pretty big campus. There's, 35,000 students and, 10,000 faculty or something. How do you even start about narrowing that down? And so they did, the lawyers work with these people to kind of narrow down the request. And so basically the first search they're going to start with is all communications between myself and my lab manager and all of the companies that are shown here. So Monsanto, Dow, Bayer, Syngenta, DuPont, Renison, BASF, from November 2009. And so for me, I don't know, I'd never delete an email. I just let it all pile up in the inbox. That was, I don't know, I had to search. It was over 100,000 emails. And then not only me, but then there's where you start to get the attention of your campus. They also wanted to see the dean's office's emails, the chair of my department's emails, and they wanted the same search there. But this is what really blows me. They want all keywords in emails from the following search: genetically engineered, genetically modified, feedstuffs, crops, agriculture, pesticides, herbicides, glyphosate, Roundup health, studies, test, human health, and animal health. If I don't have emails that comply with that, I'm not doing my job very well, right? I mean, can you tell me one scientist that doesn't have the word study in an email somewhere? You know, they're not a researcher if they don't have that. And there's nothing wrong with having those keywords in your email correspondence. And so the intent and what's being done with these emails is they get them and then take them out of context to suggest there's inappropriate collisions between the scientists and industry, and are really using it to try to attack the messengers. So they can't attack the science because there's just so many studies that show that there's nothing going on here. And so the only way in their mind that can be true is because the scientists are somehow getting paid off to do this. And it takes a lot of time. My legal department's been working on this for over a year now. It's because it's not just me, it's 12 of us at UC Davis, I think. And it really is a huge drain on the public purse to kind of comply with these things. And it's very intended to intimidate scientists and prevent them from speaking out around the science of agriculture. And so I actually, my position description, I'm an extension specialist. My job is to work with industry to help with the translation of research to the field. It was back when, artificial insemination was first introduced. That was basically extension that took that to the field. That's what we do. We take breeding methods to the field. And so that's actually what's in my job description. And so I've written a little bit about these attacks because I think they're really a serious attempt to try to silence the independent brokers that are trying to get the correct information out there and leave only a void that's very happily filled by groups opposed to this technology, who often have their own competing financial interests that they don't disclose when they're speaking on this topic. So I guess I'll finish that I think effectively communicating science is one of the most important things that public sector scientists can contribute to future generations, and just say that really we have it pretty bad. So my husband's a scientist also. He works in aquaculture. We do believe in science, and I really do think that this is a really important issue, and I just want to make you guys aware of some of the shenanigans that's going on there. So conclusions: GE crops are widely grown and traded. There's been no health and productivity effects on animals, nor milk, meat and eggs from animals that have consumed GE feed. There's many second-generation crops in the pipeline. How that's going to go, it worries me. I think it's going to create trade uncertainties because of these asynchronous regulatory approvals, and there's just this urgent need to get a more sensible approach to regulating these things, because the current system precludes public sector from participating and has created just ridiculous regulatory hurdles that are not justified by the risks posed by the products. And that's really, I think there's a modernization of the coordinated framework going on right now, and I hope that we can get to a situation that enables innovation to be used in our breeding methods, because really that's, to me, one of the most sustainable approaches to addressing the demands of our increasing population is to use innovation in breeding, because it's permanent, cumulative, and once you've done it, it's free.